Welcome to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. If you want effective and actionable tips to simplify the overwhelm of launching and managing your podcast, then this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Verity Songon, podcast manager, launch strategist, and host of a Top 100 podcast. I'm really excited to have you here, so without further ado, let's dive into the episode. Welcome back to the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. We are here with part 2 of how to grow your podcast audience. So if you have not already listened to part 1 of this, go back and do listen to that episode, because there are 3 really crucial steps that you need to make sure that you are putting in place before you're listening to this particular episode. So we're going to go through 2 more pointers, and as I said, if you want to go, or as I said in the previous episode, if you want to go through any of these pointers in more depth, I really highly recommend that you go to veritysongon.com/5-day challenge, where you can sign yourself up to the email challenge, where we go through these 5 points over the course of 5 days, and I give you actionable tips every single day in order to really dive deep into these points to help you grow your audience. So on that note, tip 4 that we're going to dive into is about social media. Now, this might seem the most obvious one, but I'm going to first of all tell you the biggest mistake that I see people making, or podcasters making, when they are advertising their podcast, and that is that they do a drop and run approach. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that they have an episode that has come out and they put up a social media post, and then that's it. That's absolutely it. They put up the one post on the day of the publication or the day after the publication, whatever works for them. But they put up one post and then they never mention that episode again. Maybe they tag people in it who have interviewed and guested on the podcast, but otherwise there's no other mention. What you've got to remember is that for most social media platforms, in fact for all social media platforms, there is a window in which your post, in which your content is most visible. So for Twitter, for example, I think currently it's around 24-25 minutes that your tweet is the most visible. And for Instagram, it's something like 24-48 hours. But you get my point. The content that you're putting out there, it's not going to be seen by that many people immediately. And again, there's another statistic saying that at any one given time, only about 5% of your followers will see the content that you are putting out there, that one post that you're putting out there. So if you're doing that drop and run approach, where you're just saying, here's the new podcast episode, and never mentioning it again, that is a lot of people, both in your current audience and in your potential audience, who you are not reaching. Now, conversely, on the back of that, what I'm also not saying is you have to talk about your new episode every single hour of every single day and completely take it over with content about your podcast and not about anything else. But what I'm saying is you need to be thinking about how you can be mentioning your podcast episodes continually so that they are top of mind for your audience. So for example, on Instagram, you might put up that one post in your feed saying this is my new episode that's come out, but then in your stories you might mention daily about the podcast episode that's come out. If you're on TikTok, you can post as much as you want on TikTok, and they really don't care in the algorithm. In some ways it loves you more the more you post. So for that, you might want to post a couple of TikToks a day or a few TikToks over the course of the week telling people about your podcast episode or doing snippets from your podcast episode. If you're using Facebook, maybe 2 posts a week on your podcast episode. Again, LinkedIn isn't overly content heavy, but you still want to be making sure that you are posting about your podcast regularly so that people are turning up and people know that it's there to turn up to in the first place. The other thing about using social media is really considering 2 points. First of all, which social media platforms do you like turning up in or showing up in? And also, which social media platforms is your target audience using? So for example, I'm not a massive fan of Facebook. I use it, but it's not my favorite whatsoever. However, I do know that a certain percentage of my audience for both podcasts sit on Facebook. So therefore it makes no sense for me not to advertise my podcast on Facebook. I also know that for the Confident CEO podcast in particular, there's a lot of female entrepreneurs, in particular within my audience, on Instagram, which is why I publicize that particular podcast on Instagram the most, because I know that is where my audience are hanging out. And I know that that is the social media platform that I enjoy the most turning up on. So you really need to think about, what do I enjoy showing up on and where are my audience sitting? Because there's no point advertising your podcast where your audience is not turning up. But equally, there's no point in putting your content on a social media platform that you really don't enjoy creating content for. So there's got to be some kind of marriage between the two, because at the end of the day, if you don't enjoy creating content for a platform, it's going to show and it's going to be really obvious to your audience as well. So as I said, there needs to be a marriage between what you enjoy creating content for and where your audience is hanging out. And finally, tip 5 for growing your podcast audience is all around word of mouth marketing. It absolutely never ceases to amaze me that people's immediate families, their immediate friends, have got no idea that they've got a podcast. Yet, generally speaking, your family and friends are probably going to be your biggest supporters, at least at the very beginning of your journey. Even if it's just your nan, do you know what? That's really nice if your nan's listening to your podcast. Kudos to her. But my point is that you've got to tell people that you have got a podcast, and not in just a kind of embarrassed way. Because if you're going on social media and you're expecting strangers to listen to your podcast, well, how can you expect those strangers listen to your podcast if your best friend won't even listen to it because they don't even know that it exists? Do you see what I mean? It's a little bit weird there. So you've got to get out there, kind of get over that fear of embarrassment. If you have got a podcast, be proud of that, because there are so many people who would love to be in your situation and also podcast. I really can't tell you how many people that I speak to and I go, that is amazing that you've got a podcast. I'd love to do that. And I'm like, well, why don't you? And I'm like, oh, I don't know where to start. I'm scared. What if I look stupid? You know, all of those things. So as I said, you in some ways you need to get over yourself and tell people that you've got a podcast. Now, I'm not saying the minute you meet somebody go and throw it in conversation unless it comes up, but for me it's, well, what do you do? I'm a podcast manager, I'm a podcast host, this is my podcast. I've been known to get my phone out before at dinners. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to everybody, but I've been known to get my phone out before and go, oh yeah, this is my podcast, and look, yeah, if you want to listen to it later, this is what it looks like. Now, that wasn't in face, that was actually in context of a conversation. But my point is tell people that you are a podcast host and you've got a podcast, because who is going to listen to your podcast if you're not telling them about it? The other thing I want you to do around word of mouth marketing is also encourage your listeners to tell their friends and tell their colleagues about the episode. So what can work really well is a call to action at the end of your podcast, saying something along the lines of, if you've enjoyed this episode, go and tell your best friend about it. Or if you've got a colleague who would find this episode useful, tell them about it. If you know somebody who has got an interest in this, tell them about this podcast episode, because then you're getting your audience involved as part of building a community, but also they're advertising your podcast for free. So let's try that right now. If you know somebody who has got a podcast or wants to create a podcast, tell them about this podcast episode. See how nice and easy that is? I've told you who to tell about this podcast episode. So word of mouth marketing is so, so important. And I think in the age of social media marketing, where we're constantly thinking, and I'm as guilty of this as everybody else, much as everybody else, but where we're thinking, I need to create this Canva graphic and do this and do that. Do think about word of mouth marketing. It's probably, no marketers come after me, but it's probably the number one piece of marketing that has been around since the dawn of time. Before we could write, before we could read, before we could do hieroglyphics or anything, I don't know. But the point is, word of mouth marketing, it works. So don't neglect it. I really hope you've enjoyed these 5 tips to helping grow your audience. As I said, I would love it if you went along to veritysongon.com/5-day challenge, because then you can join the 5-day email challenge. As I said, we do 1 tip. I've covered them very briefly in these 2 episodes, but we dive into them in so much depth during the 5-day challenge. Also on the 5-day challenge, I give you tasks, actionable tasks for you to do every single day, for you to start implementing and seeing that growth in your podcast audience. Otherwise, I will see you next episode.